Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing really well and welcome back to part 2 of this macaw parrot tutorial where I'm going to be drawing the beak, and I think I'm also going to draw the bottom part of the face as well, so all this really dark sort of black area. I'm going to start with the beak, try and get some of that shine on there as it's kind of curving round, and then we're going to carry on with these darker feathers, just finishing off the rest of the face before we can start with all our gorgeous colours. So it's another quite neutral coloured part, unfortunately, for this one. You know, part 1 and part 2 has been quite neutral, but obviously anything after that is going to be full of colour, which I'm quite excited to get stuck into. So in terms of the beak, I'm not really going to erase the initial outline because it's going to get covered up anyway with the colours being so dark. So I'm going to start with the silver grey luminance pencil, which is a really pale blue, and just use this to fill in pretty much the entirety of the beak, mainly focusing on the lighter areas. For the areas that look really dark, there's not really any need for us to add this as a base layer because we might as well just go in with a dark pencil straight away. But for anywhere that looks slightly highlighted within the beak, you just want to add a little bit of this silver grey and apply it on its side to start wearing down one side of the pencil to get that nice softer line to shade with. And it'll also give you a bit more of an even coverage as well. So I'm starting with that lower curved line all the way around. And then look at the sort of edge and the shape of the beak. We've got like the top half and the bottom half, but obviously with the angle it's kind of switched. You definitely want to add a little bit to this highlight here. And I'm kind of doing like small, not necessarily circular motions, but just constantly doing like oval motions going back and forth so it's nice and even all the way through the area that I'm shading. And I'm going to bring it down throughout the rest of the beak and probably just leave this really dark area sort of on the lower half here. So just kind of fade it off about halfway down. Then I'm also going to add a little bit to the edge of the beak up here and this highlighted part in the centre. And the rest of it is really quite dark, so I'm not going to apply any more to this part of the beak, just that middle section there. And then moving on to the feathers, again, they look quite dark. So I'm not going to use loads of this silver grey, but just where it kind of meets this lighter section of the feathers, sort of along those edges. I'm going to apply a little bit of blue there and maybe a little bit up here where it starts to merge into those yellow coloured feathers. When you're drawing something that feels quite at an awkward angle for you to kind of apply the pencil strokes, I'll often turn my paper around and sort of shade in that area in a way that feels more natural for my hand, so I feel more in control. So feel free to kind of twist your drawing round. I'm just going to keep it like this just for the sake of the tutorial so you can see exactly what I'm doing, like from a straight on angle, so it's not confusing for you. But yeah, just this little bit up here where it starts to merge with the yellow feathers. and then that is pretty much it. Everything else is quite dark, so I think I'm going to leave it like that with the silver grey luminance. Next up, I'm going to add a bit of a blue undertone, so I'm going to go in with the dark indigo polychromo, which is quite dark, and kind of outline the beak, add in a little bit of shading where it looks quite blue, but even in the darkest areas I feel like just adding a little bit of a blue tint just gives us that nice blue undertone. It stops those dark areas from looking flat. I think it just brings everything together as well, having everything looking slightly blue tinted, which it definitely does in the beak. The very bottom curve does have a bit of a lighter kind of browny green tint to it, so you just want to reduce your pressure as you approach that very outer edge of the beak. Just lightly outline that. Making sure I've got the shape of this edge right. Just going to bring it up slightly higher. Just adding another light layer into the areas that are really dark. So I've just gone along that sort of top edge with a slightly harder pressure, just so it's definitely kind of mapped out then. We've also got a little bit of a gap here which kind of shows those orangey feathers that are behind the beak. It's kind of like where the beak closes together and there's just a little gap. So I'm also just going to add a little bit into this other part of the beak, sort of shading around this highlighted area in the middle. And then I think I might add a little bit into sort of over where we added that silver grey in these feathers. So I've just added a little bit throughout those dark black feathers, just to add a bit of sort of structure. If you look really closely, you can see like a tiny little bit of highlighted detail. So I'm kind of just mapping out a little bit of that texture really. Obviously, most of this will probably get covered anyway by like a really dark black, but I can just sort of visualise how it's going to look at the end. And sort of the areas where we're going to pull out a bit of highlight. But yeah, that is where I'm going to leave it with the dark indigo. That's just added a nice sort of blue undertone to the whole area that we're going to be drawing for part 2. So next up, I'm going to go in with the ivory black Derwent drawing pencil, which is always my go-to when it comes to like really dark areas within a drawing. I'm pretty sure we did use it for the nostril and like some of these like darker feather patterns along the face and around the eye. It's literally so pigmented that you don't even need to apply a hard pressure at all. Just literally medium pressure over the area that you want to shade in, and it just applies and blends so effortlessly. I actually do really love these pencils. I just seem to have a lot more of the luminance and the polychromos. They've always kind of been my go-to, but I am starting to absolutely love these pencils even more. So I'm going to start sort of down here with this first section of the beak, where it's really quite dark. And at first you want to use just a super light pressure and kind of map out the really dark area within the beak. And as you can see, I've gone in with quite a blunt pencil, and again, I'm using it on its side to get that nice sort of soft shading. We don't really want to be seeing any pencil strokes at all really at this stage. It's quite dark all the way around the beak where it meets sort of the side of the face or those lighter feathers. So I think I'm just going to take it all the way up and around onto the next section as well. I've kind of flicked a few lines back down into those feathers. So it looks like the beak is almost emerging from underneath those feathers. And then I'm going to continue shading the darkest areas of the beak. Still using a light pressure until I'm happy with sort of the area that I've shaded. And then you can go in with a slightly harder pressure and build up that darkness. So as you can see, I keep going back to those really dark areas within the beak, just adding another layer or two with a harder pressure just to build that darkness up. But I'm also at the same time sort of filling in the rest of the beak, trying to avoid those two main highlights if I can, but just building up a bit more tone within the rest of the beak so there's not too much of a contrast, because the rest of the beak still is quite dark. Just going to lightly outline that bottom edge of the beak. And with every layer, you can probably see that we're kind of filling in that grainy texture and really squashing down the tooth of the paper, so we will end up with a nice smooth finish. This is kind of the ugly stage really, but with every layer you can see it starting to reduce. I feel like this area is really quite dark, so I'm going to press on quite hard and really push that pigment into the paper. Still making sure to flick down into those lighter feathers. So I've just added a bit of light shading into that highlighted area in the middle. I'm going to darken this lower part of the beak as well. And then I'm going to move on to these feathers above, which are pretty much all very dark other than the edges where it meets these lighter feathers and where it starts to merge into the yellow feathers and it looks a little bit green almost. So for the rest of it, I'm just going to do exactly as I've done with the beak. Start off with a light pressure and just build up that dark pigment, and especially focusing on where it's darkest and pushing that into the paper, making sure it's really sort of jet black dark. And yeah, this is also probably the darkest part of the whole entire portrait as well, so you want to make sure it is really dark, even though it might feel a bit unnatural. Once we've kind of drawn all the surrounding feathers, hopefully we'll have that really lovely contrast then. And also the neck and the head, like the position of it, is almost behind this wing. So it looks like it's emerging from behind the wing. So again, it's kind of creating that dark shadow, creating a bit more of a contrast. Those feathers look really quite dark. So maybe start by just outlining the wing feathers, because we don't really want to shade into them if we can help it. Definitely do need to get another ivory black pencil. I feel like for the past like 5 tutorials or more, I've just had a little stub. They do last quite a long time, although they're quite soft and they wear down quickly. They do last quite a long time, but I definitely need a new one. I feel like you just have a bit more control when it's like a full length pencil. You can't really have the same control when it's like this. I do have some pencil extenders somewhere where you can put like the stub of your pencil in the top and it's like holding a normal one, but I'm not entirely sure where they are. I think they're in a box somewhere from a previous in-person workshop. I'll have to root them out. Make sure you're kind of mapping out the shape of this dark area of the feathers. It's kind of easy to get carried away, but make sure you're sticking to the right proportions and focusing on the shape and that edge. So I feel like even though you can't see loads of detail, even just by applying your pencil strokes in the same sort of texture that the feathers are, it still kind of creates a little bit of detail and a little bit of texture, even when this area is quite dark. I'm going to go back in with the silver grey luminance pencil, which is the really pale blue, and just reapply a little bit into those highlighted areas, but this time with a slightly harder pressure. And you want to sort of mix the edges of that area with that surrounding darker pigment. So just by sort of shading over it and kind of mixing the two together. And you should find that because that ivory black Derwent drawing pencil is so soft, it'll kind of almost move around underneath this silver grey luminance when you're kind of shading over it. So it's very easy to blend. So remember to leave that little white gap for now. That will eventually be orange when we draw in the feathers sort of in the background. I'm going to add a little bit in the middle of the beak as well, not with as much of a hard pressure, but just to sort of add a bit of blend in, make it look slightly lighter. So as well, I've sort of blended out this dark area of the feathers and sort of merged it with the lighter feathers, kind of almost smudged it into those lighter feathers by applying it where it's dark and kind of dragging it into those lighter feathers. And then you could add just a little bit of shading, sort of back and forth motions, quite linear, to replicate the texture of the feathers into some of those lighter parts. Or not necessarily lighter parts because it's not that obvious, but just the areas where you've kind of not added as much of a dark pigment. And instead of doing like random sort of little bits of highlight, you kind of want to apply that highlighted section in rows in a way. So like all the way along this area. Then leave it darker again and then add another sort of strip of highlight. I'm also going to go back in with the dark indigo to add a bit more of a blue element that seems to have got lost. I feel like I always tend to go back in with some of those first initial colours just to kind of bring them back up to the surface. And because the polychromos are quite a lot harder than the luminants and the Derwent drawing pencils, you can probably feel with your pencil as you're shading that it's kind of really pushing those layers into the tooth of the paper, so it's dramatically reducing that grainy texture. So I'm using a medium to hard pressure, I'd say. Just trying to reduce that graininess. So you can see how I've also just added a little bit of like darker detail amongst this highlight as well. Just a few little squiggles or little lines, just so it doesn't look so smooth and perfect, because it does have a few like imperfections and like kind of like scratchy looking motions along the surface of the beak. So yeah, make sure to pay attention to those little details like that. Also added a few to this highlight as well on the left hand side. I'm going to add a little bit to these feathers up here. And I think instead of going in with the dark indigo for the rest of it, I'm going to transfer to the black polychroma, which is obviously darker, and literally do the exact same thing. I'm focusing more on those darker parts of the feathers. Just literally filling everything in. So we've completely kind of eliminated that grainy texture from the paper. So I'm really looking at the side of these white feathers, looking at how it meets the darker feathers, making sure the edge and that shape's correct. In a way, when you're drawing feathers that are kind of this scale, a lot more enlarged, it's sort of like drawing fur, like quite straight repetitive lines. But I think feathers in general are a lot more delicate than fur, because fur can come in all different shapes and sizes and so many different textures, whereas feathers are, well, kind of the same thing applies. There's different types of texture when it comes to feathers. You know, around the face you can end up with some that are very structured like this, or you can have quite fluffy ones, which we've got on the head, or we can have, you know, a lot bigger ones that are almost quite layered down the wing and stuff like that. So I guess they are quite varied in terms of texture, but as a whole I'd say feathers are definitely a lot more delicate than fur. I think with fur you can be a little bit more free flowing with your pencil strokes. So I'm just sort of flicking up to where it starts to merge with that yellowy colour, which obviously we've not got down so far. So I'm just sort of fading off the line and flicking it in that direction. So when it comes to drawing those yellow feathers, we can kind of merge them together quite nicely. Going to add a bit of detail to this section, which I think is where the bottom of the beak sort of ends. It's that kind of bottom edge. Make sure I've got that lovely merge between those darker and lighter feathers here. And then I feel like along some of the edges and in some of the highlights, we've got a slightly warmer, like brown tone going on. So I think I'm going to go in with the, well, maybe a little bit of both of the Van Dyke brown, which is obviously a lot lighter, more of a chocolatey brown, and the dark sepia, which is like the darkest brown that the polychromos do. Maybe start with the Van Dyke brown. Just add a little bit to this part of the highlight. And also a little bit to the edges of these feathers. I'm going to add a little bit up here as well. It's kind of like such a subtle addition, but it makes all the difference. And then with your dark sepia, you want to kind of do the same. I also might add a little bit to this bottom edge of the beak with the dark sepia. Feel like it's currently looking a bit too light. Like that. think I might just add a tiny little bit more of the dark indigo, just up here on this top left hand side. Just so when we start adding those yellow feathers in a later part, it'll merge with this dark blue colour and hopefully create that nice green that we're after. I'm going to add a bit of the black polychromo just around the beak area as well, just for a bit of dark extra detail. I've done a few lines kind of going downwards, slightly diagonally, and almost like crossing them in the middle in some places. I feel like that definitely shows that sort of scratchy texture in some parts of the beak. I'm going to use the art eraser. This is the Derwent soft art eraser, just to get rid of that little bit of black that's smudged. I'm now going to go in with the white Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle pencil and just add a few sort of subtle highlights over the top of the beak. You can see a few little specks and like little random marks. And I feel like even after all of these really dark layers, the white Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle pencil still shows up quite well, but obviously in a much more subtle way. The general rule is that you work from light to dark with coloured pencils, but there are a few exceptions that you can still add a bit of like highlight like this when using certain pencils like this, because this shows up really well. It's quite waxy. Other pencils don't. So I definitely recommend the white Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle pencil. So I'm just kind of glancing at the reference photo and adding in little marks over the surface of the beak just to add in a bit of detail. Going to add a few little linear lines up here where the feathers are, just to bring out some soft texture. Adding in a few little dots as well. If you want some of these dots to be a bit more highlighted and stand out against sort of the black background, you can always dip the tip of this pencil in a little bit of water, because it's a museum aquarelle pencil, which means that it's activated with water. So if I just dip a little bit of that into some water, it turns to this gorgeous sort of paint texture. So for bits of highlight, you can almost dot in those little dots, and it'll show up a lot brighter against that black background. I feel like these highlights are quite important because it shows where the light is sort of hitting the beak in different places, and it shows that it's, you know, more three-dimensional than flat, which I think is sometimes quite hard to show when you're drawing something that's really dark like this, that's predominantly black. So it does dry up quite quickly, and then it turns back into sort of a coloured pencil texture. You could also try using the craft knife slice tool, which I think we used a little bit in the eye and in the feathers in part 1. But basically you can use the ceramic blade to remove those layers of pigment, and it will reveal the paper underneath. So you can create some super fine detail with this, and especially when you've really squashed down the tooth of the paper and added quite a few layers, this is when it works best. So it should work really well, but we also want to keep those highlights really subtle. So I'm literally just using the weight of the craft knife slice tool and not really applying much pressure on top of that. I'm just sort of doing some flicky, short, straight motions back down into these dark feathers. And adding a little bit of fine detail amongst this area as well. And then we're not far off from being finished. I feel like we've not really used that many colours in this section because it is so dark. It's not really been the need to. So you can see how all these little marks really make all the difference in terms of that realism. Just going to add a little bit more of the dark indigo to this area here just to make it look a bit more blue. And then yeah, I think I'm going to leave it like that for part 2. So we've got quite a big section done there, and part 1 and part 2 have been fairly neutral in terms of colours, but hopefully from here on out, part 3 onwards, we're going to be using all these gorgeous colours, greens, yellows, blues, oranges, yeah, and really go to town on the colour. So I hope you've enjoyed part 2. We've got the face pretty much done now, so yeah, thank you for watching, and as usual I've left the line drawing, the full materials list and the reference photo in the video description below, so you should have everything that you need. But as always, any questions do let me know, and I'll be back very soon with part 3.